This is episode 342 of That Shakespeare Life. Just like the work of William Shakespeare, That Shakespeare Life is supported by our patrons. Listeners just like you can support the work we do here and access special insider extras. Learn more at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. And stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi, I'm Malcolm Hebron, head of drama at Winchester College and author of Prospero, a Renaissance Magus for the British Library. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Percy stiffened their resolve and offered to go to Cyan House to dine with the Earl of Northumberland to try and gauge the level of knowledge of the plot. After the dinner, he was able to reassure them there was no sign of the plot having been discovered, so Fawkes took up his station in the vault with a slow match and a watch.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Tomorrow night, November 5th, is when many in England will celebrate an occasion known as Bonfire Night. They celebrate this day to mark the moment King James I was saved from the Gunpowder Plot, along with many in his government, when Guy Fawkes was thwarted in his attempt to blow up England's parliament using gunpowder hidden beneath the building during an official government meeting. The event was a terrorist attack of the 17th century, to put the plot in contemporary terms, and the aftermath in England impacted William Shakespeare personally. Newly minted as the King's Men in 1603, the Gunpowder Plot is taking place just 2 years later in 1605. Just 1 month after the Gunpowder Plot in December of 1605, Shakespeare writes the play King Lear, which contains many nods to the state of James's government. But the real play most connected to the Gunpowder Plot has to be Macbeth, which I argue was the play whose performance would silence all doubt about William Shakespeare's involvement or suspected treasonous connections in the aftermath of the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. Here today to walk us through the history of this event and help us understand how this plot connected to Shakespeare is our guest, James Travers. James Travers is cultural property manager at the National Archives in London. As an author, he specializes in analyzing the language of historical sources and discovering hidden literary gems in the collections at the National Archives and elsewhere, of course. He has published 4 history titles with a literary twist: A Blackmailer at Frogmore, The Adventures of Queen Caroline's Ghost; Gunpowder Plot, Terror in Shakespeare's England, which he joins us to talk about today, as well as Gunpowder, The Players Behind the Plot, and James I, The Mask of Monarchy. He regularly engages in media work with his field of expertise and was historical consultant on the BBC's Gunpowder 511, The Greatest Terror Plot, and Lucy Worsley Investigates Gunpowder Plot. Hello, James. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Thank you for having me.
We've discussed on our show before how 16th and 17th century England was tense, to say the least, when it came to religion. But even in an environment where everybody's on edge, blowing up the government just because the king is Protestant seems like extreme measures, even for what England was at this time. So tell us about what led up to this decision. Were Guy Fawkes and his compatriots extremists, as we might call them today, or were there factions of England that sort of sided with them? Was this representative of a larger political movement in Shakespeare's lifetime?
I think they have mixed motivations. There's lots of anti-Scottish feeling and feeling about related abuses. So giving English land and offices to the king's Scottish followers. And certainly when Guy Fawkes is first questioned, that's his line, that they would have sold what had happened to the people at large as avoiding a union with Scotland and a Scottish monarchy, and they'd sort of sneak the Catholicism in by the back door. There were also a lot of the Gunpowder plotters had already rebelled. They were part of the Earl of Essex's rebellion in 1601, which you might have talked about in past podcasts in relation to Shakespeare's Richard II. So a lot of them, religion was a badge of malcontent as well as a reason for it. They were just looking for trouble. They'd had negotiations around the succession of James I, and he'd disappointed the hopes of Catholics. He'd said warm things about what he was going to do when he became king, and he didn't do them. Also, the context had changed because James came with a family and male heirs and a dynasty of Cecils to serve him and support him. There had been plenty of attempts on Elizabeth I's life when she was on the throne, but now there was no possibility of regime change just with an assassin's bullet. We also had peace with Spain, so there was no real chance of a Spanish invasion through diplomacy. So this group of gentlemen behind the Gunpowder Plot, they had a sense that they were sort of well connected diplomatically and able to act on their own. And they felt if they did something really big, that maybe Spain would think, this is such a good opportunity that we can't turn it down. If England's really vulnerable, then we can invade anyway, despite the treaty. There's a bigger sort of underlying thing, which goes back much further, which is in their own minds, they've been sort of marginalized by this new Protestant religion. So they think of themselves as the heirs of a simple English pre-Reformation piety, and they've had this new religion imposed on them, first by the Welsh Tudors and now by the Scottish Stuarts. And what you've got is a network of Catholic families in the Midlands and the North, many of them having their faith reaffirmed by the Jesuit missions of men like Edmund Campion. He's particularly successful in Warwickshire, which brings us, I think, very close to Shakespeare again.
In addition to Guy Fawkes, who is the poster criminal for this foiled plot? Who were the players involved in hatching this plan to try and blow up Parliament?
Yeah, Fawkes is interesting because he's the sort of unknown face. He wasn't particularly well known in England. He becomes the symbol of the plot, but he was at its periphery, really. He was brought in as a miner and an explosives expert. He'd spent most of his time in the Netherlands mining castles and blowing them up. When he's apprehended, he pretends to be the servant of a man called Thomas Percy, who owned the vault or rented it, the vault that the gunpowder was found in under the House of Lords. Thomas Percy was one of the three central plotters. He was a gentleman pensioner, which meant he was one of the king's bodyguard, and he'd been involved in the negotiations which brought James to the throne. He was a cousin of Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, and constable of his castle at Alnwick. He embodies those disappointed hopes of the Catholics in King James and took it personally because he'd been involved as a messenger in the negotiations which had brought James to the crown. There's a wonderful letter which the Earl of Northumberland writes recommending Percy to the king as somebody worthy of reward in November 1603, which goes, "This ancient Mercury of mine, my cousin Percy, who could not before time look you in the face but by owl light, would be glad to see your majesty by daylight. Poor men may have as great devotions as great estates, and all of them are to be cherished." 5 months later, Percy was plotting to blow the king up. So what that gave the authorities was a link to the aristocracy, because they couldn't believe that just a group of gentlemen could do this. They felt they must have connections to really important and powerful people, because rank was everything at that time. The real immediate mastermind was a man called Robert Catesby, a descendant of one of Richard III's council, Sir William Catesby, who has a small part in Shakespeare's play of the same name. And he was an Essex rebel as well. He was a sort of dashing cavalry soldier and had plans to command a troop of horse for Spain. And you couldn't quite work out whether it was for Spain in the Netherlands or for Spain in England once the invasion had happened, because what had thwarted Spanish invasions up to now was the lack of horses. And the last of the three was Thomas Winter, who's sometimes called a warrior monk. He said some terrible things about women in his letters. A scholar whose confessions form the base of the official account. Luckily for us, he's the most sort of sober, literate, and sympathetic of the plotters. He fought for Spain in Flanders as well, and he's the one that drew Fawkes into the plot with a determination to do somewhat in England if the peace with Spain helped us not.
As you alluded to earlier, there are some interesting connections to Shakespeare and the Gunpowder Plot. I want to explore some of them here. And let's start with the plotters themselves. James, did the plotters quote Shakespeare in their letters?
Yeah, I'm very interested in that connection myself. I explore it in some detail in my book. Thomas Winter seems to quote Shakespeare in a planning letter, not just the words, but the context, excluding women and preparing for masculine and martial pursuits. He wrote to John Grant, another conspirator, in August 1605, asking him to clear his house for a meeting of the conspirators about the plot. Jack, certain friends of mine will be with you on Monday night or Tuesday at the uttermost. I pray you void your house of Morgan and his she-mate or other company, whose whatsoever they be, for all your house will scarce lodge the company. The jerkin man is come, but your robe of durance is as yet not finished. I have sent you £10, which I wonder at myself for doing, having neither kine nor corn to sell as you have, but a cloak to later pawn or so when I want money. This passage, playing as it does, the high-flown romantic language, clothes and credit, echoes Shakespeare's second part of Henry IV part, Act 1, Scene 2, and specifically, is not a buff jerkin, a most sweet robe of durance. In that scene, Prince Hal is mocking Falstaff's language in praise of Mistress Quickly. So Winter's quotation sustains his joke about excluding women and readying themselves instead for masculine pursuits, since the robe of durance would protect Grant in the fighting that would come out in the aftermath of the plot. This is potentially an early and interesting example of correspondence quoting Shakespeare, confident that the reader would get the joke. It is quite possible that Winter and Grant had seen the play together. Obviously, there's no Arden Shakespeare at this point. The only way you know what's in Shakespeare is by going to see it.
Absolutely. So it's a evidence of Shakespeare's popularity embedded inside the evidence for this plot.
Perhaps the church authorities were not entirely wrong to suspect playhouses to be a meeting place for Catholics, as well as the breeding ground for vices. We also have witness statements taken in the wake of the discovery of the plot, which also give us traces of Shakespeare. The examination of John Drake, servant to Thomas Reynolds, shoemaker, dwelling in Holborn near Gray's Inn, signed by the lawyer and author Francis Bacon as one of the lords investigating the plot. This tells us Drake went to Mr. Beard's lodging in the house of one Gibson in Fetter Lane to take measure for a new pair of boots. Beard asked Drake whether there were any watching and warding abroad on the streets, which Drake replied that the night before there was much watching and searching for papists and recusants, and named one Percy, and that it was the most heinous treason there ever was which was intended. Drake heard Beard mutter under his breath, "It had been brave sport if it had gone forwards." There is perhaps an echo in Beard's remark of Snug's wish in A Midsummer Night's Dream, Act 14:2. If our sport had gone forward, we had all been made men. The Mechanicals would have had their fortunes transformed if their play were chosen to be performed before the marriage of the Duke and various lords and ladies. Almost immediately, they learn from Bottom that it has been chosen. Perhaps in the destruction of the ruler and the lords, be it sort of a parallel circumstance in which the fortunes of Catholics would be transformed if Catesby's sport had succeeded. Some people believe Francis Bacon wrote the plays ascribed to Shakespeare. If so, Bacon showed no sign of recognizing the line. Shakespeare's company had become king's men in 1603, but there is a strong sense in this small sample of Catholic and Catholic sympathizers, the ones quoting Shakespeare, not the officials. The playwright Ben Jonson was set by the authorities to seek out priests in the aftermath of the discovery and sent a letter to Lord Salisbury on the same day as Francis Bacon's evidence landed on his desk, the 8th of November, 1605.
So there's evidence that the playwrights here are responding to the plot almost as if they're having to say, we didn't have anything to do with this.
They're certainly making sure they're being seen as loyal. And of course, everybody giving evidence disowns all knowledge of it you can pick up traces of the excitement and that people know that something is up, even if they're not in the narrow circle of the plotters themselves.
Tell us about the actual discovery of the plot and how it was stopped. Who was it that was actually standing in the basement of Parliament to catch Guy Fawkes, and how did that sting operation go down?
It starts with a very mysterious and artfully written letter, which is probably worth quoting in full. It's sent to Lord Monteagle, who was one of the lords who should have been in attendance at Parliament, and left while he was having supper by a tall stranger on his desk. It says, "My lord, out of the love I bear to some of your friends, I have a care of your preservation. Therefore, I would advise you, as you tender your life, to devise some excuse to shift of your attendance at this Parliament, for God and man have concurred to punish the wickedness of this time. And think not slightly of this advertisement, but retire yourself into your country, where you may expect the event in safety. For though there be no appearance of any stir, yet I say they shall receive a terrible blow, this Parliament, and yet they shall not see who hurts them. This counsel is not to be condemned, because it may do you good, and can do you no harm, for the danger is past as soon as you have burnt the letter. And I hope God will give you the grace to make good use of it, to whose holy protection I commend you." Monteagle took his letter to Whitehall, where he found some of the most prominent members of the Privy Council at supper. The Earl of Salisbury's initial reaction to the letter seems to have been sceptical. In the official accounts, King James, in his Old Testament wisdom as a prophet, Joseph or Daniel, returned from hunting at Royston, was shown the letter and immediately grasped its significance to the admiration of his hitherto mystified councillors. This is not quite as incredible as it sounds. James's father had been killed in a gunpowder explosion, and James was always sensitive to the possibilities of assassination. The substance was quickly passed on to the plotters, and indeed it may have been read aloud for that purpose. Thomas Winter was, after all, well known in the Monteagle household. He'd served Monteagle as a secretary of some sort for several years, and had attended the prorogation of Parliament on the 3rd of October 1605 in Monteagle's entourage. Winter gave the news to Catesby, cancelling discretion, if not emigration. Catesby had another card up his sleeve. As Winter later reported, he told me he would see farther yet, and resolved to send Mr. Fawkes to try to the uttermost, protesting, if the part belonged to myself, he would try the same adventure. On Wednesday, Mr. Fawkes went and returned at night, of which we were very glad. Fawkes went out in ignorance of the peril he was in to see if anything were amiss, once more the unknown face being the most likely to escape detection. Fawkes later stated that he would have gone in any case, even if he'd known of the letter. On the evening of the 3rd of November, Thomas Winter and Robert Catesby met Thomas Percy, who'd recently arrived from the north on the King's special service. Percy stiffened their resolve and offered to go to Sion House to dine with the Earl of Northumberland to try and gauge the level of knowledge of the plot. After the dinner, he was able to reassure them there was no sign of the plot having been discovered, so Fawkes took up his station in the vault with a slow match and a watch sent to him by Percy via Robert Keyes, because he should know how the time went away. Meanwhile, the Privy Council was treading carefully. To allow the plot to ripen, nothing further was done until the 4th of November. James hoped that as the plan progressed, not merely those who were involved in its mechanics, but also those in power who were supporting them would be revealed. An initial tour by the Earl of Suffolk, as Lord Chamberlain, he was responsible for the preparations for the new Parliament, accompanied by Monteagle, provided the authorities with all the evidence they could have hoped for. They found Fawkes overseeing a large quantity of firewood in a vault rented by his master Thomas Percy. Monteagle made a few pointed remarks to Suffolk as they returned about being previously unaware that Percy, a known Catholic, rented a cellar in Westminster. Fawkes was arrested and the gunpowder discovered. About 5 a.m. on Tuesday, the 5th of November, Christopher Wright came to Thomas Winter with the news of the discovery of the plot. Winter coolly walked to the court and then to the Parliament House, but found both heavily guarded and the discovery of the plot being discussed. Winter rode off in pursuit of Catesby and Percy, who had left London the previous evening. The authorities only really began to suspect him the next day. Winter rode to his brother's house at Huddington and from there to Catesby's house at Ashby. There he received a message to meet Catesby in the fields away from the house, and the news he already knew. Mr. Fawkes is taken and the whole plot discovered.
You'd think that after Guy Fawkes and the others were arrested and this plot was squashed in this literal royal fashion, that would have been the end of it. That people would say, okay, this isn't something we should try and push forward. But I don't think the plotters got the message. James, in response to Guy Fawkes being arrested, did the supporters of the Gunpowder Plot continue to try and instigate riots and another uprising after this one?
The blow was only part of the plan. And, James's government doesn't have the kind of sort of executive power that we think of modern governments having, and the level of control. It's all based on local militias, local law enforcement. And there, as we've talked about in relation to Warwickshire, you couldn't be quite sure which way the loyalty would go. So there was a plan for a rising in the Midlands precisely because of those networks that we've already talked about. Under the cover of a hunting party, they'd seize horses from Warwick Castle, kidnap the king's daughter, Princess Elizabeth, and this element was to be led by a courtier called Sir Everard Digby. One of the most memorable scenes of the drama of the Gunpowder Plot must have been the rendezvous at Dunchurch, where Sir Everard Digby's gallant hunting party of Catholic gentlemen was interrupted by the fleeing conspirators from London. They were exhausted and beaten, but Catesby was still proclaiming the king and Salisbury dead and the Catholic rising well underway. Digby was taken aside by Catesby and told a series of lies about the success of the venture to keep him on side. Fantasy figures were bandied about, including a force of 1,000 men expected to converge at Holbeach House in Staffordshire. Catesby advised Digby to take a house in Warwickshire or Worcestershire as a base from which to prepare for a hunt. This was a front for a raiding party to capture the Lady Elizabeth, the next heir, who would be proclaimed and controlled by the plotters after the death of her father, brothers and Protestant councillors in the explosion in Parliament. Digby borrowed Cowton Court from Catesby's cousins, the Throckmortons, who have Shakespeare connections of their own. He took his greyhounds, trunks of money, and fine clothes and set off to play the role of the reassuring face, the gallant and handsome knight who would calm the fears of the young princess as she was swept up from her captivity at Combe Abbey near Coventry. She would be borne off on his horse to an exciting and romantic life as the puppet queen under a Catholic protector and then a Catholic husband. Digby stayed with Catesby, Percy and their associates, some 80 in all. At 11 at night on 5th November, the rebels raided Warwick Castle, seizing fresh horses from the stables. They had a final stand on the 8th of November at Holbeach House, 3 county militias making a mess of it, following different sets of orders because the house was on the border of 3 counties, so there are 3 sets of local law enforcement.
Because we needed more complications.
Yeah, exactly. They blew themselves up drying their gunpowder by the fire because it got wet because it was raining all the time. So that's slightly ironic, which injured many of those who remained. Catesby was killed outright. Thomas Percy died of his wounds, and Thomas Winter was shot in the arm and taken prisoner.
I can't imagine that wasn't seen as poetic justice by many.
Well, I mean, in a sense, they did. They had a moment's doubt then because they felt there's a sign of divine providence, or at least that maybe God didn't believe in their cause after all. But there was a great deal of uncertainty and contradictory reports between the discovery of Fawkes in the vault on the 5th of November and Thomas Winter's arrival in London on the 12th. Torturing Guy Fawkes for information on the 9th of November, when they had all the information they needed in Worcester, 135 miles away. So that's that's all to do with the speed of communications or lack of it.
I know we think of Shakespeare as living a sort of calm life in Stratford-upon-Avon. Definitely when you visit, it's very idyllic there and it seems peaceful. And certainly we think of London as being where more of the action was taking place. But all of this that you're outlining for us was taking place in the Midlands and in Warwickshire. And how did this all happening literally in Shakespeare's backyard? What does this do to Shakespeare in terms of placing him on the front lines of the Gunpowder Plot controversy?
I think Shakespeare is seen in sort of glimpses at the edge of the plot. alluding to its trials and evidence in Macbeth, which we'll come to. He's not quite in Warwickshire when the rebellion happens, or in the right bit of London when the plot is hatched, but he's painfully close at times there, but for the grace of God. We cannot know Shakespeare's private faith or deduce it from his work, despite the endless popular and scholarly attempts to do so. It's just possible, though, that the plot sheds some small light on an issue which has interested and to some extent disappointed me about Shakespeare's life for many years, and which can be summed up briefly and anachronistically in the question, why didn't Shakespeare go to Belgium? Of course, Shakespeare and his contemporaries spoke of Flanders, though not with any degree of precision, not least because they often meant Antwerp, which is in Brabant. To Guy Fawkes and Thomas Winter, no less than to Ben Jonson, George Chapman and Christopher Marlowe, Flanders meant opportunity. This included diplomatic patronage of the imperial court at Brussels, the financial lure of Antwerp, the great metropolis on which the English wool trade and the city of London depended, and which produced more English books than London, and the military opportunities denied to Catesby and others at home in the armies of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. There are opportunities for non-Catholic Englishmen to fight against and spy on the great Habsburg machine just over the water, but the principal lure and rewards were for Catholics and Catholic sympathisers. As far as we know, Shakespeare was never lured. Our traditional view of him has him coming to the dicey world of London theatre, enjoying royal patronage as the King's man, and overcoming a number of legal challenges to establish at the Globe an operation which gave his company increased financial as well as artistic control. This eventually allowed Shakespeare to retire comfortably to his native Warwickshire and present that final balding alderman image of himself, which we all find so difficult to reconcile with our idea of sublime genius. Looked at again in the context of the Jesuit Edmund Campion's successful mission there and the rebellion planned by Robert Catesby of Lapworth, Warwickshire begins to look slightly less comfortable and insular. Perhaps Shakespeare did not need to travel. The tensions, rivalries, risks and rewards, which were shaping Europe on a grand scale in the Low Countries, were also being fought in day-to-day life on his doorstep between the besieged Catholic gentry and the searchers, the sheriffs and the missionary priests. The drama of the overnight loss of fortune, the betrayal of neighbour by neighbour, were all too common and real, and his place, more pressingly than in normal circumstances, was to secure his family and interests closer to home. The councillors themselves, the belief that the plot could not have come from a small group of gentlemen and carried through with their own connections and resources, is of course an assumption not dissimilar to the one made about Shakespeare's inferior rank and his success as a playwright. For both, aristocratic patronage was a possibility, but not something to be relied on. In both cases, the gentleman did it.
I have an article on my website where I argue that the play Macbeth is actually a love letter, essentially, to James I in response to the Gunpowder Plot as a way for Shakespeare to prove his loyalty to the king. I'll link you to this article so you can read my full thoughts and see the evidence there. But James, do you think Shakespeare would have had a need to declare his loyalties after the Gunpowder Plot? I know you mentioned that Ben Jonson was going out of his way to say, hey, I'm loyal to the king. And how would Shakespeare have been personally implicated in this plot?
Well, if it is a love letter, it's a very ambiguously worded love letter. Yeah, Macbeth is very interesting in relation to the plot. As we've said, with the accession of King James, there was a royal Protestant dynasty with the Cecil dynasty to serve it, an unending succession like the vision of Banquo's progeny in Macbeth. What, cries Macbeth, will the line stretch out till the crack of doom? You can hear a touch of Catesby's anguish in this cry. It seemed to hold the prospect of the lot of Catholic families deteriorating forever. And then very prominent in the play is the doctrine of equivocation, and its exponent, Father Henry Garnet, who the authorities blamed for planning the plot. Henry Garnet, the Father Superior of the English Jesuit province, was perhaps the most influential individual interrogated by the commissioners investigating the plot and the one who caused them the most difficulty. Thanks to the doctrine of equivocation, which he wrote about at length, he felt able to lie with calm religious conviction in a good cause, though it cannot have been the first time that the authorities were aware that a suspect was telling them less than the truth. Garnet's equivocation seemed to have enraged them, threatening to undermine the whole basis of gathering and crediting evidence on which the investigation was based. Equivocation achieved some celebrity and made its way into the foul mouth of the porter in Macbeth. Faith, here's an equivocator that could swear in both scales against either scale, who committed treason enough for God's sake, yet could not equivocate to heaven. It may not be a coincidence that this remark is introduced with a joke playing on one of Garnet's many pseudonyms and his fate. Here's a farmer that hanged himself upon the expectation of plenty. Perhaps Garnet, alias Darcy, alias Wally, alias Measley, alias Farmer, like a true martyr, welcomed his own hanging on the expectation of a place in heaven. Equivocation appears again in serious context later in the play. The ambiguity of the witch's prophecy becomes the equivocation of the fiend when Birnam Wood does after all come to Dunsinane. As always with Shakespeare, there is more than one way these lines can be read. Is the treason for God's sake? Will heaven see through the equivocator's lies, or is he simply too devout to lie to heaven? Is equivocation devilish, or is this simply a tyrant's view of prophecy telling him the truth? Perhaps in their ability to say two things at once, the playwright and the priest had much in common. The witch's prophecies of Macbeth's rise and circumstances of his fall, and Banquo's royal posterity, are part of a mysterious background to the Scottish play, which conventionally is said to show the ancient barbarity of that kingdom to a sophisticated London play audience. It's striking to a modern audience how much the king and investigating commissioners were swayed by prophecy and used the power of ambiguous, oraculous language. The Monteagle letter was a kind of prophecy. They shall not see what hurts them. Part of a chain of events which showed the operation of divine providence in the discovery of the plot. We tend to think of the witches and their Vatic statements as a piece of period colour, showing a primitive, misty alien country where the old gods still lurk under the veneer of recent Christianity. In fact, prophecy was of pressing importance to the king and the Attorney General in the investigation of the plot. The Lords Commissioners took Catholic credulity and the secret power of priests very seriously. Catesby, Robert Winter, and Guy Fawkes were all looking to posterity and the power of prophecy to fuel unending struggle and revenge. Yes, I have my doubts about Macbeth as a love letter, but I shall read your article with great interest.
Thank you. I think it's worth mentioning that that line from the porter in Macbeth about equivocation was spoken before James I, less than a year after the plot was discovered, and only a couple of months after Garnet was executed, because he was executed in May of 1606. And so whether or not Shakespeare, we don't have signed affidavits to say, I was definitely writing this to King James, but I think it was definitely a line that was powerfully felt in England at the time that it was spoken.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
One of the interesting pieces of history related to the Gunpowder Plot is that James I had a commemorative coin made that featured a serpent. There are artifacts of these surviving today, and I will put some of the pictures in the detailed show notes for today's episode. But James, can you explain the significance of not only the symbols on this coin, but why was it important for James to commemorate this kind of event with this kind of coin?
The coin is a very interesting thing, but it's not issued by James directly. It's issued by the Dutch Senate. They're celebrating James's preservation and the expulsion of the Jesuits from the Netherlands. The snake among the lilies is the Jesuits, and the things that go with it, the epigrams are, he who conceals himself is detected by order of the Senate. And the legend on the reverse is taken from the 121st Psalm. He that keepeth thee will not sleep. So that's carrying on that idea that James has been preserved through divine providence. So though it's not issued by James, it's adopted the government's agenda, which is the thing that really kept the plot fresh and kept the controversy going for 400 years. What was the role of the priests in planning or preventing the plot? And was James's preservation divine intervention or something rather grubbier? It led to two polarized views of the plot and of Catholicism in England, which bedeviled any moves towards toleration well into the 19th century. What the documents tell us is something rather more human. The view that historians have taken of the Jesuits in the plot has generally been in two forms. One concedes the government's case. The Gunpowder Plot is just the latest in a string of Jesuit-inspired plots, which seem to them to be the principal function of the English mission. This version seems to fly in the face of much of the evidence collected by the government's own exhaustive investigation, which revealed the reluctance of the plotters to submit or confide in their confessors, and the genuine attempts made by Garnet and others to dissuade and deflect them. The second version accepts the contention of all the priestly narratives that there was no role for the Jesuits in the plot other than as a source of restraint. The carefully hedged language of the evidence of Garnet and the others is clearly suggestive of a third possibility. There was a consistent sense in the Jesuits' evidence that the plotters had brought ruin on their fellow Catholics by acting precipitately. There was an underlying suggestion that the priests expected to be involved in the planning and timing and coordination of the plots to restore the true faith and had been disappointed not to be. The grounds of their disavowal of the plot were contingent. It did not have papal blessing or military support overseas or in the country. With their advice and support, they implied it might have had all those things. The state was very worried about the binding power of Catholic ritual and the use that can be made of popular superstition.
As we've explored here today, there is a great deal of history worth exploring surrounding the Gunpowder Plot, and I heartily recommend that you start with James Travers' books, both the Gunpowder Plot, Terror in Shakespeare's England, as well as the book Gunpowder, The Players Behind the Plot. They are great places to begin when you want to learn more about this subject. But James, we ask our guests here on That Shakespeare Life to give us a starting point. If we're wanting to research this topic further, what are some reliable recommendations you can give us in addition to your own book for where we should start when we want to learn more?
I think one of the most useful recent sources and an easy way in some ways is the 2014 docudrama Gunpowder 511, The Greatest Terror Plot. That's the English getting dates the wrong way around. It's 511 is the 5th of November as far as we're concerned, not the 11th of May. That is available online. It was made by the BBC, but it is out there, made available by the Tudor Society. I was historical consultant on that, and there's quite a lot of my book in it, but it's a really accessible way into the plot and the way it works. There are some very good books, including Mark Nichols's Investigating Gunpowder Plot, which really goes into the detail of what the state did and how long the investigation went on. If you're ever in any doubt as to whether there was a real plot and whether, it wasn't something that was all made up for propaganda purposes, the fact that it went on the investigation for years and months afterwards and consumed the entire government is a pretty good indication they took it seriously. And of course, there's Antonia Fraser's Gunpowder Plot, Terror and Faith in 1605, which has been going on since the late 90s. The best remote access to the original sources at the National Archives in London and at Hatfield House, where Robert Cecil eventually took his papers, is via State Papers Online, which is a subscription only, but a lot of research institutions have it, so that you've got digital copies and the calendars and transcriptions. And the digital copies are very high quality. They're easier to read than the originals. When I was doing my first book in 2005, I had to get the originals out of a salt mine in Cheshire and look at them, and that they were quite difficult to transcribe and work with. But with the online versions are brighter and easier. By the time your podcast goes out, Lucy Worsley Investigates the Gunpowder Plot should be available in the US on PBS, and I'm the historical consultant on that too. That may cast some new light.
I'm looking forward to seeing that. And all of these resources are excellent. We will place direct links to all of these resources in the show notes for today, so you can find them easily. Now, James, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
This is an ambition which every English person harbors. This is since I'm unlikely to get on desert island, this is a great privilege. I'm going to be very diplomatic and choose a great American novel, which is Mason and Dixon by Thomas Pynchon. It's the story of two Englishmen, an astronomer from Gloucestershire and a surveyor from County Durham, drawing their line across America. It's ambitious, very funny, and very long, which I think is ideal for a desert island.
Oh, see, I'm based in Alabama, so I know about Mason and Dixon down here. So that's a very good choice. I think understanding that history is a good selection. So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, since Gunpowder came out in 2019, I've written another book based on the sources here at the National Archives called A Blackmailer at Frogmore, The Adventures of Queen Caroline's Ghost. It tells the story of a blackmailing novel about the daughters of George III and their secret lovers at Frogmore. It's a novel that was suppressed and preserved by the government, and it tells the blackmailing career of its author, an Irish soldier and captain called Thomas Ashe, including his travels in America and his falling out with Thomas Jefferson. My next book will take me back to Shakespeare's time and a lost play by his rival, George Chapman, for which our only evidence is a court case in Star Chamber. The play is a true crime drama of a teenage girl defrauded of her inheritance by her own father. It will bring some of the characters from the Gunpowder Plot story back on the stage, in the audience and in the courtroom, while the plot was being planned.
These sound very exciting. We will place links to James's work in the show notes for today, so you can find those and explore more about him and follow his work so you can find these books as well. James Travers, thank you so much for being here this week and taking us through the history of the Gunpowder Plot and how it's connected to Shakespeare and Warwickshire and just helping us unpack all of this fun history from this time period. Thank you so much for being here to share it with us.
Thank you, Cassidy. I really enjoyed it.
The list of resources and recommendations we've been talking about today, along with more information on James Travers and how you can follow his work, is available in the show notes for today's episode. Find all of these things at CassidyCash.com/episode 342. If you'd like a more in-depth look at the history related to the Gunpowder Plot today, including some archival images, museum artifacts, and portraits and paintings and things, you can check out the detailed show notes that's available for patrons of our show. On the regular show notes page, you can click the button that says Become a Patron. There, you can either join us as a patron or log in using your Patreon credentials if you're already a supporter of our show. And all of this bonus content will expand right there on the show notes page. Again, that URL for this week is CassidyCash.com/episode 342. That's CassidyCash.com/EP342. If you enjoy learning about the life of William Shakespeare here on the show with us and you're ready to try out some of this history for yourself, then consider signing up for Experience Shakespeare, the membership platform here at That Shakespeare Life that lets you try out a piece of Shakespeare's history for yourself with activity kits and mini short courses on things like card games, recipes, and crafts that let you cook, play, and create your way through the life of William Shakespeare. Each kit and course is designed to be a science lab for Shakespeare's history. It's a chance for you to really try out something that you learned about here on the show. You can learn more and sign up today at CassidyCash.com/experience. Patrons of our show get a discount on Experience Shakespeare using the code available on our Patreon page. Again, that link to sign up for Experience Shakespeare is CassidyCash.com/experience. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.